Welcome to the first episode of our special interview series, available to Contramundum supporters. This episode is available in full for those who have signed up at contramundumpod.com/premium. Today, we will be talking about one of the great American heroes of the 20th century, Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh was the son of a Minnesota representative by the same name. He lived a life of high notoriety and mass popularity, yet never having been the product of regime celebrity propaganda. Lindbergh's was truly an organic fame, a self-made hero. He was Times Man of the Year in 1928, a Hoover appointee to the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, a recipient of the Congressional Gold Medal. As we will discuss, he was in a sustained tension with FDR and the Northeastern elite. And even after he was smeared for his anti-interventionism, he was eventually rehabilitated by Eisenhower as a national hero. Lindbergh was a key player in the original America First movement, a coalition of anti-interventionist activists who were strongly critical not only of American involvement in World War II, but also in the overall trajectory of Anglo-American foreign policy. The chairman of the America First Committee, General Robert E. Wood, would constantly urge Lindbergh to take over the leadership of the committee because Lindbergh, more than anyone else in the movement, had the ability to capture the attention and enthusiasm of the everyday American. In this discussion, we will relate Lindbergh to the broader America First movement and the hidden history of World War II. Here, FDR is seen as a nefarious figure who represented not the interests of the American people and their way of life, but rather his own domestic and foreign agenda. Much of this involves Stalin's global agenda and the use of the organs of American media and institutional power to forever change Western society. Thank you for listening, and please enjoy.
The American Revolution, in other words, is never finished. It must always be renewed.
Greater love than this hath no man, than that he lay down his life for his friend.
What if it's not envy?
We must take back our cities, and take back our culture, and take back our country. God bless you, and God bless America.
Well, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Contramundum with CJ Engel and me. And our special guest today is Mr. Ron Unz of Unz.com. And today we'll be discussing Charles Lindbergh. So welcome, Ron.
Hey, great to be here.
Yeah, so Ron, thanks for joining us. Obviously, we're talking about an essay that you recently wrote. You've been talking about World War II revisionism for years now, and Lindbergh, of course, plays a key role in understanding the opposition to the New Dealers' War, if you want to, position it that way. But there's a whole history of America First. That phrase that Trump used has a well-rooted American past, and Charles Lindbergh was on the cutting edge of that point of view in World War II. So I guess before we get into World War II and Charles Lindbergh and all of that, why don't you tell everyone about yourself and why you're writing on these types of topics?
Sure. Well, my original background actually was in theoretical physics. That was my professional training. But then about 35 or 40 years ago, I shifted into computer software, financial services software. And then more recently, the last couple of decades, I've really just been doing a lot of work in politics, writing, research, that sort of thing. And part of it actually was I started a project about 20 years ago now, a little over 20 years ago, to digitize the archives of America's old opinion magazines and other publications. And as I was doing the digitization, I really discovered that so many things of the American past were very difficult, very different than I'd ever imagined. In other words, it was a very strange thing. I mean, my background was really very mainstream and traditional in terms of standard history books. And when you came across actual articles in the leading publications of American society, say 80 or 100 years ago, and what they reported about events was so different than what I'd ever been taught in the history books, that really made me start becoming much more curious about the true nature of American past. And that's really what I've been spending a lot of my time over the last 10 or 15 years doing. In other words, re-exploring the true history of the United States and the world and seeing in what major areas it might differ from the conventional narrative that all of us have gotten from our college classes or from the American media.
It's funny when you talk about revisionism because some people will get into the depths of the American Revolution and the colonial period. Some people are interested in the Civil War, but when you talk about World War II, something totally different happens. It seems like the stakes are higher, and it also seems like you draw a lot more scrutiny. So I guess like the first question would be, why is that? But why are you doing it anyway? Why is it so important that we really understand World War II uniquely?
Well, I mean, the truth is, World War II was not only the most titanic military struggle in the history of the world. I mean, there's nothing remotely to compare with it. But it's also the foundational event of the modern world. In other words, everything we see in the modern world is really based on the outcome of World War II. And just as you said, it's sort of a curious thing. In fact, one of the books I recently read was by a fairly prominent mainstream historian, H.W. Brands, on Lindbergh and World War II and those issues. And in some of the interviews he'd given, some of the public lectures, I mean, he's a very mainstream figure. He's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. A couple of his works have been finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. In one of his public lectures, he actually emphasized the fact that every American war has always been subject to what people might call revisionism a few years afterwards. In other words, people have gone through it and decided whether what we believed at the time was correct or not, with the sole exception of World War II. And that was a point that he emphasized. And it's, just a really ironical thing that we're talking about the most important shaping event of the modern world, something that caused the deaths of more Americans than all of our other foreign wars combined, yet has been completely immune from the sort of reconsideration that the Vietnam War or the Korean War or the First World War or other conflicts have had. And, so, I mean, from my point of view, I mean, I've really explored many of the other issues in the last 100 or 150 years of American society, not just the Second World War, but certainly given its importance, the Second World War has been a very large part of that. And what I gradually discovered as I really went through it and looked at a lot of the history books and the events of that period, the publications of the period leading up to the Second World War, is that so much of what I thought I knew of that era was very different. In other words, the truth is, all of us have heard of, for example, of the Stalinist purge, the great purge of Stalin in the late 1930s. And what a lot of Americans don't realize is that American society suffered its own great purge in the year or two or three leading up to the Second World War. It wasn't a blood purge in that the people involved were not executed. They weren't sent to the Gulag, but they were purged from the American media. They were purged from respectability. They really were eliminated from American history. And so you have a long list of some of the most prominent journalists, academics, and public intellectuals in American society who disappeared so thoroughly from the American record that I'd never heard of any of them. And it was a very strange thing, for example, as I started going through these publications, The Nation, The New Republic, The Atlantic Monthly, from the late 1930s or, the rest of the 1930s. And I would see dozens or even sometimes hundreds of articles written by obviously very prominent mainstream top intellectuals in American society. And I'd never heard of any of them. It's a very strange thing. I mean, it's somewhat the analogy I use is that you can imagine, for example, a Kremlin researcher going through the archives of the Soviet Union, say in the 1970s, and discovering to his shock and amazement that Leon Trotsky, the notorious Nazi spy and traitor, had actually been the right-hand man of Lenin himself, and that all of other Lenin's top lieutenants had later been denounced as traitors and spies and capitalist agents and all executed. I mean, it would be an astonishing thing to discover that the entire historical record of that era was so different than anything he imagined to be. And I saw exactly the same thing when I was looking at, for example, the period around the Second World War, which was, a tremendous shock to me.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, you mentioned, um, you know, people who have been blacklisted basically by history. My background is actually in the libertarian movement, so I spent a lot of time on Mises.org. And while I'm not of that persuasion anymore, they still have some of the best resources, and they have publications that they have available that nobody else provides. And so you can read things like they'll refer to like AJP or PJ Taylor,
AJP, yeah.
JP Taylor,
AJP.
and Harry Elmer Barnes,
Yeah.
and some of these others, Tansel. I mean, you mentioned some of
Yeah.
these people in your essay too, but there's this entire history by very mainstream professors and analysts of American foreign policy that have been talking about this. So when we bring it up today, we're considered crackheads. Like, there's just absolutely, we're not even on the same planet as, the media is and the official establishment on World War II. And yet there's a very strong record that we can pull and refer to talk about some of these things. And of course, it's shocking to me, and as you laid out in your essay, it's shocking that someone like Charles Lindbergh would basically be considered unmentionable today. At one point in time, he was the most popular man on the planet. Can you give us a sense of that? How popular was he? And maybe compare that to modern figures. How would you rate Lindbergh in terms of like the public perception?
Exactly. Now, from my point of view, I mean, Lindbergh obviously was a name I'd always heard of in my textbooks. In other words, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic, a great public hero. His child was kidnapped and killed, and then he became a leading opponent of American intervention in Second World War. So I knew all those things. I mean, it was probably a half dozen sentences in my basic history books. And then, as it happened, as I started becoming a little bit more interested in the events leading up to American involvement in the Second World War, I discovered he'd been a very prominent figure in the anti-war movement, what was called the American First Movement at the time. And I became much more curious about his background, his involvement. And so, I guess it was probably a few years ago, I happened to read the Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Lindbergh by Berg. And it really was extremely thorough. And I mean, the things I discovered about Lindbergh early on in the book were absolutely shocking. I mean, his tremendous public stature. Basically, he became the first global celebrity hero, not just in the United States, but worldwide. When he crossed the Atlantic in a small plane, which nobody had ever done before, 150,000 Parisians came out to see him. I mean, a gigantic crowd. When he then went to Belgium a few days later, 1 million Belgians came to see him, the largest public session of Belgians of any private figure in the history. And the same thing, hundreds of thousands of British people saw him. When he came back to the United States, he was given a ticker tape parade in New York City. According to the accounts of the time, 4 million people saw him that day. In the months that followed, as he traveled around the United States, 1/4 of the entire American population came out to see him in person and hear him in his public lectures. I mean, we're talking about a celebrity whose rank has never been equaled probably in the more than 100 years since then. I mean, a tremendously popular figure. And I mean, I'd certainly known that Lindbergh was a public hero, but I mean, the sense that he was given just a couple of sentences on that point in my history books, when he was actually the greatest popular hero in the world at the time and for years that followed, really just shocked me. And, it all was a consequence of his involvement in the effort to keep America out of the Second World War, which really, was a tremendous struggle. It wasn't just Lindbergh, just as you mentioned. Some of America's leading public intellectuals, leading journalists, leading public figures, leading business people were involved in that effort. And in fact, the campaign involved, which was called the America First Movement, was the largest grassroots political organization in all of American history. 800,000 people joined that effort. And it's almost entirely been written out of the history books so that, it receives 2 or 3 sentences in the standard histories of that period, which really is just remarkable. So it shows you that, when you really look at the nature of American society or the nature of American history, it's almost like a circus funhouse mirror. And the things that were very small at the time they occurred have been expanded to gigantic proportions. And things that were incredibly large at the time have shrunk to total insignificance or almost entirely disappeared from the historical record. And, it just makes someone very cautious about accepting the events of today as reported by the American media. I mean, one way I describe things, take, for example, the New York Times, the most respectable, sober, mainstream American media outlet, or really world media outlet today. It represents the mainstream media. If you take the things that the New York Times was publishing 50 years ago, many of those things would be so outrageous today, they would be considered fringe conspiracy theories by today's New York Times. And many of the events that today's New York Times reports of the events of the past would have been treated in the same way by the New York Times of 50 years ago. So, I mean, they can't both be right. They obviously, are both probably right in some ways and wrong in other ways. But it means we have to be very, very cautious about believing what the media tells us about the events of today. And we've certainly seen that in the last few years. I mean, the complete reversals of the media narrative regarding China, regarding Russia, to some extent regarding individuals like Donald Trump has really been shocking. And, I really, what I found is that those reversals in many cases were even more extreme in the past. And they mean that to discover the truth of what happened in the Second World War or the First World War or the events of other historical epochs, we really have to simply look at as many different sources of information as possible and then weigh them against each other and do what proper historians do. In other words, try to come out with the correct narrative based on all of these conflicting sources of information.
Yeah, Ron, you mentioned the America First Committee having 800,000 people, close to a million members, and especially what was the population of America in 1940? Like 100 million, something like that. So that's like 1% of the country is a member of that organization, which shows much broader strength, right? So many people. I mean, the polling in 1940 for America staying out of the war wasn't it like 80%
Exactly.
in some
80%.
polls? Yeah. So the degree to which American opposition to entry into the Second World War it is something that's just unknown. I mean, I remember when I was in college and I'm getting the mainstream historical narrative. It's just a footnote. Oh yeah, the American people are opposed to it, and then we were bombed in Pearl Harbor, and then all of a sudden they are totally for the war. And so, the question that I have, just in terms of historical revisionism, right? Historical, re-examining the sources, going back and getting a more correct narrative about what happened. Do you think that like that right there is one of the first places people should start? Is why were Americans so opposed to going into this war, and would that have an effect on? I mean, you cited Charles Tansel's Backdoor to War in your essay, which for me was kind of the first red pill on the question of World War II revisionism. I think Ron Paul in one of his books had that as a recommended book to read, and I went and read it, and I was like, whoa, this is what happened. This is what they were doing, and it's all public. These are all State Department documents and Henry Stimson's journal and things like that. Do you think that is the first place people should look when they are re-examining the Second World War? Is America First, the strong public opposition to it, or what are some other areas if not that?
Well, I mean, that's certainly one of the things to look at. I mean, also some of the broader overall histories are really remarkable. For example, a name that you'd cited was Professor A.J.P. Taylor. Now, A.J.P. Taylor is a very mainstream historian. I mean, he was really one of those popular historians in Britain. Oxford University, he'd spent 25 or 30 years there. Very. And in fact, actually, one of the ironic things is when some of these issues started to come up, when I was an undergraduate, I mean, his book, The Origins of the Second World War, was assigned as one of the main texts in my introductory history course. Because, again, it was an international bestseller, widely praised by all the leading journals at the time. Washington Post, all of these publications regarded as a classic work when it came out in 1961. And what he basically argued in his short book, and again, in the opinion of many, Britain's leading historian of that era, was that obviously Hitler did everything he could to avoid the Second World War. In other words, from Taylor's point of view, a British diplomatic blunder led to, for example, the circumstances that caused the outbreak of the Second World War. In other words, the blanket guarantee to Poland, which prevented them from negotiating with Germany over the city of Danzig. But I mean, when you have Britain's leading historian of the 1960s, somebody, again, top mainstream figure, writing a book in 1961 that became a widely praised international bestseller, providing a version of the outbreak of the Second World War that was totally different than what everybody had received for the last 20 or 30, 40 years in the American mainstream media. I mean, that's really just a shocking development. And I mean, Taylor was not somebody who was ever purged in the way that, for example, those Americans were purged. In other words, he was actually regarded as quite anti-German in most of his writing. And, his book was on my college reading list in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So, again, it's a very popular book today. But his presentation was totally different than what probably 95% of Americans would believe today about the origins of the Second World War. And so, that certainly was true about America's involvement in the war. And, Tansel, I mean, that's a perfect example. Tansel was one of America's leading diplomatic historians, very much opposed to the war. And he wrote, a very widely, regarded book, on how FDR basically had used pressure on the Japanese in hopes of persuading the Japanese, of forcing the Japanese to go to war against America as a means of America getting involved in the Second World War, when all of his provocations against Germany had failed. I mean, the point is, and one contribution actually I've made in some of my own research was to discover, because of my digitization of the archives of all these major publications, a figure that I realized was a very, very significant figure of the era was somebody named John T. Flynn. Now, John T. Flynn is well known among revisionists in that, he was a leading opponent of America's involvement in the Second World War. He was the head of the American First Committee for New York City. And after the war, he became, a very strong revisionist figure writing books about it. But what I hadn't realized was he'd been probably one of the single most influential progressive liberal journalists in America in the decade prior to the Second World War. He was a leading writer at the New Republic, which was the leading liberal journal. I mean, he was a very, very influential figure. And in fact, he was purged from the New Republic and his other, venues because of pressure from FDR. Now, the shocking thing about it, and this is something that I came across when I was looking through some of his writings in the New Republic, at the beginning of 1938, he published a column in the New Republic saying that he was absolutely shocked that it looked like FDR was going to move America towards a military conflict as a means of getting America out of the Great Depression. What a lot of people don't realize is that obviously FDR came into office because of Hoover's disastrous policies that, with the Great Depression, huge unemployment rates. And then FDR implemented a lot of his New Deal policies. But by the end of the New Deal, by the 1937, 1936, 1938 period, the New Deal had essentially failed. In other words, American unemployment rates in 1937 had spiked back to as high as they were at the time FDR came into office. And for that reason, it looked like the New Deal would be written off as a failure. FDR would leave office under a cloud. And he really had no way of getting out of that box he'd gotten himself into. Because, I mean, there were, as Flynn mentioned in his discussion with the top FDR aide, there were no additional sources of funding, of spending that FDR could use. And so what Flynn was told by a top FDR advisor was that, it was easy. What FDR's administration then would do would simply be to focus on a major military buildup and an international war that would get America out of the Depression. And that's actually exactly what happened. In other words, mainstream historians grudgingly admit in modern history books that it was only the outbreak of the Second World War that pulled America out of the Great Depression. In other words, the New Deal, even though they very much support the New Deal, they admit that by the end of the New Deal, American unemployment was almost as high as it had been at the beginning. And it was only the outbreak of the Second World War that had moved America out of that economic crisis. Now, later historians have been able to find that FDR put tremendous pressure on the British, on the Poles, on other European powers not to settle with Germany's demands. And that was probably the single biggest factor that led to the outbreak of the Second World War. That's always portrayed in a very positive light, that FDR recognized the tremendous global menace of Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. So he realized he had to stiffen the spine of those European leaders to ensure that Hitler was stopped when he was. But what I discovered was that years before that, 2 years before the outbreak of the Second World War, a top FDR advisor had told John T. Flynn, one of the leading progressive columnists in America, that FDR had decided that a foreign war was the only way to get America out of the Great Depression. And at that time, he had actually focused on a war with Japan as the means, because at that time, Germany really was off the radar screen. And then it was only later that year or the next year that Germany became the focal point of his war. But what we have is a situation where FDR at the early January 1937 had decided on a foreign war for America as a means of solving America's economic problems, looking towards Japan. Then, in the next couple of years, he applied tremendous pressure to ensure the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe. And when you combine those facts together, plus some of the later research that was done by Harry Elmer Barnes, by John T. Flynn, by all of these revisionist historians, I think it's very clear that the single individual probably who was the greatest cause behind the outbreak of the Second World War was our own president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And he did it for reasons that had nothing to do with the global climate, nothing to do with the threat of Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. He did it simply because it was his only hope of getting America out of its economic problems. Now, it turns out exactly the same thing had happened in an unexpected way in the First World War. In other words, what people don't realize is that in the years prior to the outbreak of the First World War, America had been experiencing very difficult economic times. And then when the First World War broke out, because of misperceptions on the part of the different parties that without America at all being involved, that very quickly caused such a huge demand for American production and American goods that it brought America out of its economic difficulties and produced a huge wave of prosperity for the United States. So that explains why Roosevelt believed he could do exactly the same thing intentionally with regard to the Second World War. And that, I think, is one of the main factors. There's such tremendous reluctance on the part of mainstream American historians to ever re-explore the causes of the Second World War. 50 to 60 million people probably died in that conflict. It ended with half of Europe controlled by the Soviet Union and the Communist Empire. It was one of the most disastrous conflicts in the history of the world. And there seems to be a great deal of evidence that the single largest cause of that war was not so much Britain, it was not so much Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, it was the President of the United States who did it entirely for domestic political reasons. And that's really a
Is-
horrifying thing to recognize.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this is fascinating because I don't think a lot of people really understand that specific angle. And that's why looking at it through the lens of Charles Lindbergh is so important, because he was someone who had an interesting relationship with FDR in terms of public perception and all of that. And so Lindbergh was someone who the American First Committee recognized could be a very important representative of their cause. And so maybe talk a little bit about what America First was. What was the America First Committee? Because, you talk about FDR being, wanting to do this for economic reasons on the domestic front, but who were the America First Committee participants? Were they business owners? Maybe talk a little bit about that. Where did that come from, and what were their interests?
Exactly. And now, there have been a number of different anti-war groups and individuals who saw what was going on, that America was being pushed in the Second World War despite the total opposition of the American people, and viewed that conflict as being potentially disastrous. And so a number of small organizations were set up, sometimes competing with each other, but none of them really got off the ground. Charles Lindbergh personally was very strongly opposed to Americans' involvement in the war for exactly that sort of reason. In other words, he viewed it as a disastrous conflict, as a conflict that once it broke out in Europe would probably lead to the destruction of Europe, especially if America got involved. And he believed America should be strong and defend its Western hemisphere, but follow the will of the American people and stay out of the conflict, in the way that the American people after the First World War had decided they'd made a disastrous mistake by involving them in that war. So Lindbergh actually was then invited to speak at a number of different events. I mean, he was the most famous, prominent figure in American society, our greatest national hero at the time. He also was somebody regarded as one of the world's leading experts on aviation and military aviation. So he could speak very knowledgeably about the German Air Force, the British Air Force, the French Air Force, the American Air Force, and that America simply would be very mistaken by getting involved in the war. One of the places he was invited to speak was actually Yale. A number of Yale students invited him there. And his speech went over so well, it was so gripping, the points he made were so strong, that afterwards a group of Yale students decided to found an organization on campus called the American First Committee, or America First Against the Involvement in Foreign War. And it included, for example, it quickly grew to include some people who became very prominent in later life. John F. Kennedy became one of its early members. Gerald Ford, another president of the United States member, Gore Vidal, Sergeant Schreiber. I mean, a large number of very, very prominent people joined what was an anti-war activist organization, because they knew their generation, in many ways, would be called upon to fight in this disastrous foreign war that 80% or more of the American people opposed. Once they started their committee, a number of other people saw what was going on and became involved and tried to make it more of a national organization, bringing on board some leading businessmen. For example, General Robert Woods, was the chairman of Sears Roebuck, which at the time was the equivalent of Walmart, one of our largest retail corporations. He and a number of other top business executives then supplied funding to the committee to make that organization, founded by a group of Yale students, a national organization. And it grew to include tens of thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of individuals, including, for a time, for example, Henry Ford, our leading industrialist. He pledged support for it. A lot of other business executives and political leaders became involved. And they then decided that what they really needed was a public spokesman who was prominent enough to be able to go toe-to-toe with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our very powerful president at the time, and Lindbergh was their universal choice. So Lindbergh at first was reluctant to become involved because he felt it would restrict what he could say publicly. It would put, maybe basically if we were operating as the face of a committee, it would put more restrictions on his activity. And he always had been a very independent-minded person. But they finally urged him to get involved. And once he became involved, he was able to, because of his public prominence, quickly become by far the most prominent public figure opposing the war. Think of it. Lindbergh was a tremendous celebrity. I mean, it was the sort of thing, whereas most of these other opponents of the war would have a very hard time getting any media coverage and media time. Lindbergh could simply say that he wanted to give a public speech, and it would immediately be covered by all the radio networks, all the newspapers. I mean, Hollywood repeatedly asked to take, for example, snippets of his talks and put them in their newsreels of the time. I mean, Lindbergh was a titanic celebrity. And the interesting thing I discovered in reading, for example, that Lindbergh biography that I mentioned, was several years earlier, Lindbergh had actually challenged FDR on an entirely different issue, whether the U.S. Army Air Corps or private air firms should be delivering the mail. The mail had been delivered by private air companies, and then FDR decided to shift all the deliveries to the Army Air Corps instead. Lindbergh opposed that, arguing that our flyers simply weren't equipped to handle the heavy loads of planes. And, Lindbergh basically was able to get invited to speak before the Senate committees. It was covered by all of the media, and it turns out he was entirely correct, and then a lot of the planes ended up crashing. So FDR therefore had to back down, and it was FDR's first political defeat since coming into the White House. And so Lindbergh, having successfully challenged FDR on that relatively minor point 6 or 7 years earlier, regarded himself as somebody who could take on FDR in this much broader issue of war and peace. And that's really what happened. In other words, the debate for the next year or two, from late 1939 to 1940 to especially 1941, was by and large a debate between the President of the United States and America's greatest national hero, Charles Lindbergh. And Lindbergh was, able to raise all of these public points and put a face on the America First Committee and, bring so many hundreds of thousands of individuals into that organization. Now, it's an interesting story in that at the time, Lindbergh's views were certainly supported by some of the leading senators of that era, some of the leading Democratic and Republican senators who were absolutely opposed to American involvement in the Second World War. In fact, there was some talk by some of them at the time that Lindbergh should actually challenge FDR for president, run for president in 1940, either against FDR or whomever FDR would pick as his hand-picked Democratic successor. And Lindbergh turned against it. I mean, Lindbergh regarded it as ridiculous. But then a few years ago, a couple of decades ago, we had that famous novel by Philip Roth discussing a hypothetical scenario where Lindbergh actually ran against FDR in 1940 and was elected. And that's probably what many, since it was a best-selling novel by a leading American novelist, that's probably what many people know about Lindbergh today, that, he was a Nazi agent, a Nazi spy, a fascist sympathizer, all of that total nonsense, which has nothing to do with the reality of that era. And so, we're talking about the fact that because of Lindbergh's opposition to the Second World War, something that was in accord with 80% of the American voters at the time, Lindbergh then became an unperson. He was purged from American history almost entirely. And the man who'd been America's greatest national hero for 2 decades now probably is remembered by a large fraction of the American public as some sort of fringe Nazi sympathizer, which is just utterly ridiculous. And it shows people, I think anybody who goes back and looks at the history of that era, or even reads mainstream biographies, such as that of, of Berg, can see that, for example, so much of what people believe about the American history of past decades has nothing to do with the reality of that period and would be considered utterly bizarre if you brought it up with any of the contemporaries of that era.
It's funny because if you look on Twitter at, if you're using phrases like America First or something, you'll get like all of these responses by unhinged leftists, basically like showing Ku Klux Klan marchers with America First signs saying, okay, this is what you support because you're America First. Can you kind of give us a sense of what the America First participants looked like? Was it right-wing or conservative? Were there progressives involved? Like, what was the America First and its origins?
Well, it was very much of a bipartisan organization. In fact, it made every effort, since it was such a mainstream organization, to keep away from it any people regarded as on the ideological fringe, especially the right-wing ideological fringe. So exactly the sort of individuals that you're describing, it's been tagged with today, are exactly the sort of individuals it refused to have any association with at the time. Now, again, it was a mixture of entirely different ideological backgrounds. Someone like, for example, John T. Flynn had been probably the leading progressive columnist in America at the time, and he was one of the leaders of American First. Another person, for example, was Norman Thomas, the leader of American socialism, who'd run for president on the socialist ticket several different times. Another example would be a totally forgotten figure of that era, Oswald Garrison Villard, who'd for decades been the owner of The Nation, America's leading left-wing publication. And for probably 20 or 30 or 40 years, he'd been probably the single most prominent leftist figure in American society. He was one of the founding figures of America First. So we had a mixture of right-wing people, conservatives, mainstream middle-of-the-roaders, liberals, leftists, and outright socialists, all of whom were committed to the single issue of opposition to America's involvement in what they regarded as a disastrous foreign war. Here's another very interesting thing that came up only about 20, 25 years ago. A mainstream historian published an important political monograph in which he went through the archives and discovered that much of the opposition to American First had been organized by the British Secret Service. In other words, British intelligence agents infiltrated American society, and they organized the efforts to discredit or oppose the America First movement. It would be very much like, for example, if the Ukrainian Secret Service sent dozens or hundreds of agents into American society right now and used those agents to try to destroy the political careers of all those individuals who were critical of the Ukraine war and our support for the war against Russia and Ukraine. And that actually, to some extent has been happening. And many conservatives, many pro-Trump people know it happened. And that happened in a much more extreme way in the 1930s and early 1940s, without almost any of the people in America First being aware of what happened. And it's really shocking. It was a much more naive period back then. In other words, people were much more trusting of the American government, especially in American society. And I'll give one example of that. In other words, in that book, and we're talking about a very respectable research study by a mainstream historian, he made a very strong case that the Republican presidential nominee of 1940, Wendell Willkie, had actually been given the nomination by the efforts of the British Secret Service. It sounds shocking, but when you look at the Wendell Willkie story, which I'm not somebody who paid much attention to American history prior to my investigation of these issues. I was shocked to discover that, again, the Republican Party back then, the American country overall, was 80% opposed to American intervention in the Second World War. Non-interventionist. The Republican Party was probably 90% opposed to interventionism.
Yeah.
Individual prominent Republicans favored it, but the vast majority of Republicans opposed it. And that obviously put FDR in a very difficult position. If he ran for a third term, he would be facing a Republican candidate entirely on the other side with regard to intervention. And that would either force him to make absolute binding commitments that America would not be involved, or probably lose his unprecedented third term. But what actually happened was something entirely different. The Democrats nominated, the anti-interventionist Republicans nominated a pro-interventionist Democrat as their presidential candidate in 1940, which is just astonishing. We're talking about somebody who'd spent his entire life as a committed, active Democrat until a few months before he accepted the Republican presidential nomination. He'd been a registered Democrat, and his views were totally out of sync with probably 90% of the Republican Party. it was considered a shocking development at the time. He was totally obscure figure. He wasn't a famous figure like Lindbergh. He was somebody nobody had ever heard of. And he suddenly managed to seize the Republican nomination against all of these far better known anti-intervention Republicans. And as was shown in that monograph, a very, detailed search of the archives, it very likely was due to the active involvement of a foreign intelligence service, which is really shocking when you think of it at the time. In other words, to have American politics controlled by a foreign intelligence service is something probably most Americans would not believe if they were told the story today. It would sound like something, an utterly fringe conspiracy theory, but it's proven by the archives.
Yeah, I mean that would be like today, the overwhelming majority of the Republican Party, like the biggest issue in 2024 is deportations, mass deportations. Now, it would be like somehow John McCain rising from the dead and being made the Republican nominee in 2024.
Worse than that. John McCain was a Republican. We'd be talking about, for example, nominating an anti-deportation Democrat.
Like John Kerry or something.
Exactly. It would just be totally
it's incredible.
And again, it really was amazing that none of the Republicans at the time realized what was taking place. I mean, they were all just shocked by these strange events taking place. In fact, as that very mainstream historian demonstrated, again, there's actually quite a bit of evidence that a certain number of Americans may have actually been murdered by the British Secret Service here in order to, attain their ends. I mean, again, nobody very, very prominent. But I mean, to give you one example, the man who was chairman of the Republican convention at the time was a dyed-in-the-wool pro-Taft Republican. And, again, by controlling the convention, he could have basically probably ensured Taft's nomination. And he suddenly dropped dead at the age of 56. In a very strange way. And I mean, the author of that book notes that, for example, the documented archives showed that the British intelligence service contemplated the necessity of sometimes committing murder, if necessary, to achieve their ends in American society. And he says, maybe, for example, the person's body should be exhumed and it should be determined whether or not he was poisoned at the time. And there are other interesting characters, cases of, for example, people who died mysteriously under those circumstances in 1940 and 1941 to sort of clear the path for American involvement. And I mean, those are the sorts of things, obviously, that intelligence services are expected sometimes to do. And it really was just shocking. Now, the British intelligence service involvement was done with the full cooperation of FDR's administration. In fact, they were the ones who gave FDR that totally fabricated map, which he held out, saying that, for example, Hitler intended to conquer Latin America and seize control of the Latin American countries, which was an utter absurdity. We're talking about Germany having no significant surface navy. Germany had no ability to cross the English Channel to occupy Britain. And the American people were told by FDR that Germany planned to cross the entire Atlantic Ocean and seize control of Latin America prior to invading and conquering the United States. Was just utter absurd. And basically it was all based on a fabricated map that British intelligence had put together and given to FDR, which FDR then held out as claimed that they gotten from a very reliable source. So, I mean, we're talking about basically FDR in collusion with the British intelligence service, forcing America to get involved in a war which the Americans did not want to be involved in.
Yeah, I mean, that would like all of those things. It's incredible, but I mean, I think most people today know that weird, shady things happen in politics. I mean, you could bring up Hillary Clinton and all of the people that end up dead, or like the Seth Rich murder, for example, in 2016. And you think, well, okay, that's today, that's now. That didn't happen during the greatest generation in 1940 and 41. That never would have happened then. We were good. But it's like, no, these things have always taken place. There's always been subterfuge and chicanery and espionage going on, and why wouldn't that be the case in that, especially when something so inexplicable like the nomination of Wendell Willkie in 1940 happens? Like, how else do you explain it?
Exactly. It's utterly bizarre. And, again, as somebody who'd never really studied American history, I vaguely knew the name Wendell Willkie, the first who lost in a landslide to FDR. But I might have even read that he'd previously been a Democrat. But I never realized he'd been an ardent Democrat his entire life until a few months before he became the Republican presidential nominee, which is just something utterly absurd. And, it's the sort of thing. The other interesting thing about it is that in the aftermath of the Second World War, as I've mentioned in another one of my articles, a number of the most prominent people, prominent political and military figures in American society died under very mysterious and strange circumstances. And that actually included Wendell Willkie. In other words, Wendell Willkie, after losing in a landslide to FDR, because he basically was a Me Tooer to FDR on the issue of intervention, he then became a strong ally of FDR. He was hoping that FDR would make him a president, make him his vice president, make him his heir and successor. And then shortly after the end of the Second World War, Wendell Willkie suddenly died under mysterious circumstances, I think at the age of something like 54, 55, certainly not an old man. And Willkie was only one of 6 or 7 individuals, top individuals, in the American government, American society, who died under very strange circumstances. For example, some of them, the leading communist spies in American society, all died under mysterious circumstances. For example, one of the most powerful hidden figures in the Roosevelt administration was Harry Dexter White, who'd been a Soviet agent. He was revealed by the Venona decrypts as having been basically a Stalinist agent. Although he was the number 2 person in the Treasury, he actually ran the Treasury because Morgenthau, who was nominal superior, really was a very ignorant man. Morgenthau had never graduated either high school or college. He was a wealthy dilettante who was FDR's next door neighbor. And that's how he got to be Treasury Secretary. And so, with someone like that who didn't know anything about finance or business, as Treasury Secretary, his number 2 after he ran the department, that was basically a Stalinist agent. And by the end of the war, Harry Dexter White had extended his control into the Department of State as well. He was one of the most powerful figures in the Roosevelt administration. He was then purged. He was then removed from office after the end of the Roosevelt administration and called for hearings, Senate hearings on Soviet espionage. But then after the first hearing, before he was called for a second one, he suddenly dropped dead at the age of like 54 or 55. Which, again, a very strange person. And no autopsy was done on him. And another top Soviet agent ended up also dying under very mysterious circumstances. We had Patton, for example, General Patton, one of America's greatest heroes in the Second World War, who died also in a very strange circumstance, in a mysterious car crash right after the end of the Second World War, just before he was planning to return to the United States, resign his commission, and start a national speaking tour, as he said in his diary, to inform the American people of the truth of what had happened in the Second World War, which he claimed was entirely different than what they'd been told by the dishonest American media. Another person, Harry Hopkins, for years had been the second most powerful person in the Roosevelt administration, much more powerful than Roosevelt's vice presidents. He lived in the White House. He'd moved into the White House. He was called the deputy president in America. And after Roosevelt had died of natural causes, a few months later, Hopkins also died of supposedly a bleeding ulcer. I think, again, the age of like 52, 53, something like that. So we had all of these leading figures in American society suddenly dying, generally in their mid or late 50s, most of them under very strange circumstances in the aftermath of a war that involved so many curious, strange figures. So, again, it's not a question of whether any of these individual mysterious deaths certainly could have been things that happen. I mean, random events like this happen. But when 5 or 6 of these very influential figures, including known Soviet agents,
Yeah.
died together in a short period of time, all of them under very strange or mysterious circumstances, it really strengthens our suspicions that many of the events of that period were very different than are reported in our media of the day or our history books that we learned in college.
What do you attribute those deaths to? I mean, is that just cover up stuff, or is that has to do with the rising tensions with the Soviet Union? Like it was after Roosevelt died that all of these people, these confidants, were being wiped out. Like, is that just random cover up?
Or like White's death? I mean, easily could have been, especially since he's being called to Senate hearings about Soviet espionage.
Yeah.
That Stalin's like, all right, he's got to die now because he's going to spill his guts.
Exactly. In fact, again, White died, and in the same period of about a year or two, several of the most important Soviet agents, former Soviet agents in the United States, also died under mysterious circumstances. In other words, a number of them suddenly decided to commit suicide by jumping off tall buildings, or they died in
As one does.
mysterious ways. And so, in those cases, I think it's very clear that Stalin's agents decided to, prevent discovery of the network by simply eliminating those loose ends. In the case of some of these other people, it's difficult to say. In other words, it's possible that, for example, that the British Secret Service might have done the same thing. And, imagine, for example, if Wendell Willkie had published his memoirs describing how he became the Republican presidential nominee in 1940, after having been a lifelong Democrat until a few months earlier. I mean, there are a lot of people might have been very, very reluctant to see that come forward. So, same thing. Harry Hopkins. I mean, he was the second most powerful figure in American society for 6 or 7 years, and to have him write his memoirs might have made a lot of people very, very nervous. So, it's hard to say about these other individuals. And in fact, it might have been, some of them might have, fallen victim to certain parties, others to other parties. But I think it's more than a pure coincidence that so many of them perished in a short period of time, under those circumstances. In fact, put it another way, if there had been any similar series of mysterious deaths of top-level people in, for example, Stalinist Russia, in Germany, in Britain, in China, all of the American history books would have said it was obvious that those important people were silenced because they knew too much. But when it happened in American society, exactly the same sort of elimination of top individuals in the aftermath of the Second World War simply never appears in any of our history books. Now, it just seems, it's possible that it was all entirely coincidental. But when you're talking about 5 or 6 or 7 people of that rank, all dying under mysterious circumstances in a relatively short period of time, I think we have to really say that it's more likely than not there was something else. It was not pure chance.
Yeah. Well, I think, just making that, argument, discussing those things, if you had said that, like, if I told your standard Fox News watcher or CNN watcher about these things 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, they would think I have lost my mind. I need to start wearing tinfoil on my head, things like that. But in the kind of post-Epstein world, where people have to admit, like, there is big stuff going on behind the scenes at the highest level, really bad stuff, and this guy just suddenly winds up dead in his cell. I think people are much more likely to buy that thesis than they would have been, even 5 or 6 years ago.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
And even the point about Harry Dexter White. If you went, walked down the street and asked 100 people if they knew who Harry Dexter White is, or that one of the most important people in the Roosevelt White House was a Soviet spy, they would not believe you.
Exactly.
Right? If you told them, they wouldn't believe it. And the fact that that's not taught at all should be something that everyone like when you discover that, you're like, whoa, we need to re-examine everything in the history of World War II because there was a Stalinist agent at the top of the U.S. Treasury. What? That's insane. But it's reality. It's what happened.
Exactly. Exactly. And not only that, but I mean, basically, he arranged to give the printing plates and the formula for ink for the American currency, occupation currency in Britain, to the Soviet Union, so they could print an unlimited amount of American currency for use. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And not only that, but I mean, you had, then all these other individuals, like, I mean, basically the famous Alger Hiss case. And by the way, Harry Dexter White is known. I mean, it's not that anybody disputes it. To give an example, a very liberal columnist, in the Washington Post back about 10 or 12 years ago. There was a big story in the Washington Post on the Bretton Woods Agreement, in which, the post-war financial architecture, the IMF and everything like that was established. And that article in the Washington Post, big headline story, mentioned that, for example, Britain was represented by Lord Keynes, one of the towering economic figures of that era. And America was represented, the article mentioned, by Harry Dexter White, the number 2 at the Treasury Department, who was a Soviet agent. So, I mean, the Washington Post said it in the early paragraphs of their big story. But, I mean, it doesn't then get repeated. So that, probably, if you asked 100 Americans who Harry Dexter White is, I think you'd get 0 out of 100. Maybe if you asked 1,000 Americans, you might get 3 or 4 out of 1,000. And he was one of the most powerful figures in the American government. Not only that, everybody knows about the Venona decrypts, or, people have studied that area, know that we've discovered these things because of our code-breaking operation, where we broke the Soviet diplomatic codes, allowing us to then gradually piece together the list of Soviet agents in the United States. It was a decades-long effort, and it finally persuaded mainstream historians that, for example, Alger Hiss was a Soviet agent, that Harry Dexter White was a Soviet agent, and dozens of these other important figures were actually Stalinist agents. The Venona project was a secret project of the Defense Intelligence Agency, in other words, a code-breaking operation. It turns out it came to the attention of one of the Soviet spies. I think it was Kim Philby who found out about it. And Philby then relayed that information that we were breaking the Soviet codes, obviously, to his controllers at the Soviet Union. And they then got a top White House official to issue an order to Venona that it be shut down, all the records destroyed, and all the codes returned to the Soviet Union. So, in other words, a direct order from the FDR White House ordered the Venona project to be halted. And the only reason it continued, and we know about this ring of Soviet agents, was because the military officer in charge of the project risked a court-martial to directly disobey an order from the White House. And in fact, it's unclear which of the Soviet agents in the White House issued the order, but it was certainly one of them. So in effect, the Soviet Union controlled the White House under FDR to the point where he could shut down America's own code-breaking operation with a direct presidential decree.
Ron, I have a question about FDR and the Soviet Union. So in your opinion, was FDR influenced heavily by Soviet agents, or was he actually in control? Was he in the driver's seat, or was he being controlled by other agents? Who was the senior party and who was the junior party in this?
I think it was a mixture over time. And don't forget, FDR towards the end of his life was in such terrible health that he died before the end of the war. So in other words, in the last few years of his life, he certainly was much less vigorous and active than he had been earlier on. And in fact, here's another example, even more shocking than any of these things I've mentioned so far. FDR, when he ran for re-election in 1940, was opposed by his own vice president and by much of his own Democratic Party, because it was an unprecedented step for a president to run for a third term. No American president had done that since Washington. So FDR then ended up picking somebody who was totally controlled, Wallace, Henry Wallace as his vice presidential nominee. Henry Wallace himself had been Secretary of Agriculture and Secretary of Commerce under FDR. Henry Wallace was a true blue American patriot. There's not the slightest evidence Wallace was at all disloyal to the United States. But Wallace was a very naive individual, so that all of Wallace's top advisors were Soviet agents. Wallace was totally under the control of Stalin, the Soviet Union. In fact, later on, Wallace, when he ran for the presidency himself in 1948 on an independent sort of pro-Soviet ticket, he then announced that if he'd become president, he would have put two individuals in charge of our State Department and our Treasury. Harry Dexter White would have become Secretary of the Treasury, and another individual, I think Lloyd Dugan, would have become Secretary of State. Both of them were revealed by Venona to be Soviet agents. So in other words, if Wallace had become president, America's entire federal government would have been under the control of known Soviet agents, or people became known Soviet agents afterwards. Wallace was FDR's vice president in the first 4 years of the 1940s. If FDR had died a year earlier, or if he'd renominated Wallace as his vice president in 1944, America would have fallen under the control of Stalinist foreign agents. It's just a shocking thing. And I doubt if even 2 Americans in 100 are aware of that fact. America came within a heartbeat of falling under the control of Stalin in the mid-1940s, in the middle of the Second World War, which is just astonishing. So
it is astonishing. Yeah, I mean, the astonishing thing about that is we are told over and over again that the great Satan of the 20th century was Hitler, but nobody on the American media scene ever mentions that fact, that Stalin, this mass murderer, was literally about to take over the United States government.
Exactly. And again, none of this can be disputed. What I've said right now, the fact that, for example, Henry Wallace's, all of his key advisors were Stalinist agents, is admitted by probably 95% of all mainstream historians. All mainstream historians know perfectly well that Henry Wallace was FDR's vice president for the first 4 years of the 1940s. And so if FDR had died a year sooner, Wallace would have become president. There's no doubt about that. But people don't connect those two facts together.
Yeah.
And it's
incredible.
Exactly.
It really is. I want to go back to something that you had mentioned earlier about the American First Committee, or America First Committee. And that was Henry Ford's involvement. And the interesting thing about that, just even as you're relaying it, if the thesis, and I think it's largely true, the thesis that FDR is pushing the war because he wants to get out of the Great Depression. I mean, I think there are also grand foreign policy designs that he wished to pursue as well, that influenced him into wanting to enter the war as well. But I think both those work in tandem. But the interesting thing about that is Ford, if the United States goes to war, and it did go to war, right, Ford would make a lot of money. Like, he would make a lot of money building engines for tanks and airplanes and manufacturing all sorts of things. And he would make so much money. And typically especially the mainstream of our country thinks that, billionaires are always just out for money. They want to get rich. And so that's why they do the things that they do. But Ford, who would be, comparable to someone like Elon Musk, I would say, in terms of stature and prominence and wealth, he is opposing something that seemingly is against his best financial interests, right? If America goes to war, get out of the Depression, he's going to sell a lot of cars, and he's also going to convert his factories into wartime manufacturing and make lots of money. But he doesn't want that. Right, he wants America to stay out of the war. So I guess talk a little bit about Ford's motivations. I mean, we're kind of far afield from Lindbergh, but I think but also talk about how the two of them overlapped, especially in your article. you mentioned the things that Ford had written about the war, and particularly the things that are is so-called anti-Semitism and things like that, and Lindbergh's alleged anti-Semitism as well. Like, talk a little bit about the overlap between those two figures, if
Oh,
you can.
exactly. I mean, basically, Lindbergh and Ford actually were close friends of each other. They'd been friends for many years, and they shared very many of the same policy ideas. So Ford was also vehemently opposed to getting involved in the Second World War. What's interesting is it seems, as far as I can tell, relatively little of the pressure to getting involved in the Second World War came from American industry or arms manufacturers. In other words, they'd been very heavily involved in the effort to get America involved in the First World War. But in the Second War, then they were blasted for it by congressional investigating committees afterwards. So I think partly for that reason, they were very gun shy about getting involved in the politics of the Second World War. So they really weren't involved. As Lindbergh said in his famous speech, I mean, the thing that really forever, in a sense, destroyed his reputation in mainstream American society afterwards, the three groups involved in pushing America towards the war more than any other were the Roosevelt administration, for the reasons I've given. Britain, obviously, because Britain had no hope of winning the Second World War without American involvement. And the third effort was obviously the Jewish groups in American society, who were very, very hostile to Hitler's Germany. And so for that reason, wanted America involved in the war to defeat or destroy Germany and, basically prevent it from gaining effective control over Europe. And in fact, the interesting thing is, I think, as I'd mentioned, early on, Roosevelt had apparently been planning a war against Japan in order to get America involved out of the Great Depression. And I think it probably was then the growing hostility of Jewish groups towards Hitler's Germany that then shifted him towards the European direction. In other words, he hadn't really been thinking about a war in Europe at the time, but that was where, by, for example, late 1938, or certainly, the early months of 1939, he'd completely shifted and gotten his diplomats to do everything they can to sort of press the British and the Poles to not compromise with Germany, not settle things diplomatically, instead, cause the outbreak of a war there. So in terms of Jewish groups, the interesting thing about it was that communist groups in the United States, because of the quasi-alliance between Stalin and Hitler in the aftermath of the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939, communist groups were actually anti-war in the United States for most of the 1940, and then most part of 1941. But the moment then Hitler and Stalin went to war against each other, all the communist groups and the groups they influenced turned on a dime and went from being vehemently anti-war to being vehemently pro-war in such a way that, they really made themselves the subject of ridicule. And that, I mean, for example, they really, it was the sort of thing, there was one pro-communist writer who ended up, he'd written all of these books and articles denouncing American involvement in the war, saying what a horrible thing it would be. And then after the Stalin-Hitler war broke out, when he received fan letters supporting his own writings, he turned them into the FBI. Dangerous supporters of Hitler or something like that. So it was really very absurd things going on.
Curious, yeah.
So I mean, they were certainly an element, but I mean, they were much less powerful. It was basically just what Lindbergh said in his famous September speech of 1941. Lindbergh had been very reluctant to be completely forthright and name the groups that he and his fellow members of American First were struggling against, exactly for the reason of being fearful of being condemned as being anti-Semitic. And so then when he finally felt that the tide was turning against him and it looked like America would probably get involved in the war, he decided to bite the bullet and come out with, the simple truth of what was going on, that everybody recognized in private, but nobody was willing to say in public. The interesting thing about it was that there was no negative reaction regarding Lindbergh's statement that the FDR administration was pressing for war, or that the British were pressing for war. It was all the statement that American Jewish groups were pressing for war, even though everybody knew it was the case. And Lindbergh softened the blow as much as possible by saying, just as he certainly understood why the British were pressing for war, because they wanted to win the war. Britain was in a fight for its life. He certainly understood why all the Jewish groups in America and in Europe that felt that they'd been treated very harshly by the Germans, by Hitler, they regarded Hitler as their greatest enemy. Certainly he understood why they were pressing for war, but he felt that America had to take a position that was in American interests rather than the interests of any subsection of the American population. So that's, for example, simply what he said. And that caused a firestorm of reaction all across the United States. To show you how sensitive the America First Committee was and the issue of being perceived as right-wing or anti-Semitic, Henry Ford, again, the leading industrialist in the United States, wanted to become a member of the committee, and he was brought on board briefly, but other members of the committee felt that because Ford was perceived as being anti-Semitic, they couldn't have him involved. And so Ford then was asked to distance himself and ended up giving up his membership in the national leadership of the committee. So, I mean, we're talking about the America First Committee was, again, one of the most cautious mainstream sort of organizations you can imagine, doing its best to avoid any taint, even the slightest taint of extremism anywhere. Bringing on board in a prominent role all these liberals and leftists, including a number of prominent Jewish figures. And yet, when the history books were written decades or years later, it was entirely turned on its head. And probably most people would regard them as a pro-Nazi, pro-Ku Klux Klan organization, which couldn't be any farther from the truth. And, you know, when you read, for example, mainstream history books written by these top scholars, I mean, they describe, when they're given questions from their audience in their public lectures, they basically describe someone like Lindbergh as being a very mainstream person on issues of Jews or Jewish influence in American society, somebody very much in the mainstream of the American public at the time, who has then simply been demonized as a ridiculous pro-Nazi, ultra-right-wing figure, which couldn't be any farther from the truth.
Yeah, I mean, Ron, do you have time for one more question here?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm curious about is, why do you think that all of a sudden, maybe in the post-Obama years, people really want to understand the 20th century and especially World War II? They're more open to other explanations. They are more interested in what you're describing here as sort of a hidden history. Why are people interested all of a sudden? What's going on in the world that you think is causing that?
I think the single biggest factor is the appearance of the internet. In other words, when you think of it, how much would any of us know about what was going on in the world today if all we had were the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and a few of the television networks? I mean, do you think Donald Trump would be president under those circumstances? Not very likely. And so, you know, with the growth of the internet, with the growth of social media, suddenly we have an ocean of information that we'd never had before. Now, most of that information is false. Most of it is nonsense. Most of everything we know about the world from any source is nonsense. But within that mountain of factual misinformation, we can still find the thimble of factual truth that we discover for ourselves that turns out to be entirely different than what we'd gotten from our history books, from the mainstream media, or from the television networks over the last 20 or 30 years. So I think far and away the internet is the single biggest factor. The other factor, obviously, is all the strange events of the last 10 or 20 years. In other words, you know, the fact that, for example, we went to war with Iraq over the weapons of mass destruction that we then found had never existed. When people, for example, have discovered over and over again that some of these sweeping narratives, Russiagate, for example, when we discovered Russiagate was an entire hoax, a hoax maintained by virtually all of the mainstream American media, including much of the conservative mainstream American media, the Republican mainstream American media. When we discovered that was entirely a hoax from beginning to end, when the Jeffrey Epstein case comes up, when all these other cases come up, you know, we then become very suspicious about the past when we discover so much of the present day is different than what we believe. In other words, if we find out that what we've been told about the present day world, about what happened in the last few months or the last few years, is entirely false, and is purely dishonest propaganda, it makes us very suspicious of what happened long ago and far away.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
only the internet that allows us to discover those things.
Yeah. So I mean, my last question, and then I can turn it over to Andrew to see if he has more. But my last question is, are there any other general books that you would recommend for these types of things? I know you're always citing, great books. Some of them are hard to find, and but like I don't know if you've read Wayne Cole's books on America First. So do you have any recommendations for people that want to read more on this specific topic?
In fact, I mean, Wayne Cole is certainly a prominent figure in that regard. In fact, it was a figure very much in the academic world. And in fact, I just happened to read one of his books only a few weeks ago. It was when I was really getting together my Lindbergh article. Afterwards, somebody suggested Wayne Cole's book on Lindbergh, so I just read it. I guess it was probably 2 or 3 weeks ago. I mean, a really very solid book, one of the fundamental academic history books of that era, that then became the basis for books like, for example, Berg's biography, or then Brand's discussion of the FDR-Lindbergh battle in 1940. So, I mean, I certainly would recommend at least one book I read by Wayne Cole was very solidly done. So he's more of a primary source researcher. And, you have academic researchers like that are really probably, useful, but again, more the sort of foundational building blocks that more mainstream historians then use for more popular histories. I mean, for example, I certainly would recommend Berg's Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Lindbergh. I mean, it's a very long book. I think it runs about 600 pages, but, it's very well written, very highly regarded. And, in terms of more recent books, I mean, there's so many of them. There's so many dozens or hundreds of them that I would recommend. I think, for example, A.J.P. Taylor's book on the origins of the Second World War, it's a slim book. I think it runs probably 100, 150 pages, maybe 200 pages, something like that. But we're talking about Britain's leading historians of that era, top Oxford scholar, a book that was on the top reading lists of America's most prestigious universities, at least until 20 or 30 years ago, that was widely praised by all the mainstream publications. So in other words, if you read that book and you tell people about it and they say, who is this, some sort of fringe figure? You can quote the Washington Post, you can quote the Times of London, you can quote all of these leading figures. You can quote Wikipedia on who A.G.P. Taylor is. And so, you're talking about a very, very solid figure on the basis of that. And then obviously, if you want to read then books by Flynn, for example, Pat Buchanan wrote really a very good book on Winston Churchill about 15 years ago, 12 or 15 years ago, The Unnecessary War, that really relies on many of these fundamental historians like Taylor, like, some of the other ones I've mentioned, on the building blocks to a much more popular history of the Second World War. And I certainly would recommend that one. So, I mean, there are quite a lot of books on different eras. In fact, one thing I try to do with my articles is always cite the books that I would recommend for further reading and the bibliography of these different works that I've put together.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, I think that's about, all the time that we have today. Ron, where can people go to read more of your stuff? Like this conversation probably has piqued a lot of interest for a lot of people, and they probably want to read all of American Pravda, which how many hundreds of thousands of words
It's
is
a
that
lot.
entire series? Yeah.
It's over 100 articles now covering a wide range of different events from the last 120 years. And it's actually getting close to 1 million words now. It's, I think, like about 850,000, 900,000 words.
Yeah. And where could they go to find that?
Well, I mean, we have a website, the Unz Review, unz.com, which provides a wide range of different alternative perspectives, left-wing, right-wing, libertarian views that don't even fit anywhere in the ideological spectrum. We tried to provide a convenient venue for views that are excluded, important, controversial views that are excluded from the mainstream media from whatever ideological direction. And obviously, all of my own writings are there. So, for example, there are a number of boxes. I've grouped my writings into articles on the Second World War, conspiracy theories in general, the COVID outbreak, and then my long American Pravda series that has all those different articles on numerous different issues where the American media, the mainstream media, simply doesn't give you an accurate view of what really happened.
Well, wonderful.
Good. Well, thank you, Ron, for your time today. And I want to thank all of our, subscribing listeners. Thank you very much for the support and for giving Ron, it seemed like it went way too fast. There's always more to learn from Ron Unz. So make sure you go to unz.com before you go to contramundumpod.com to sign up for more. But, thank you, Ron, for your time, and everyone else. We'll see you in a week.
Hey, well, thanks very much for having me.